Well, it indeed is a joy and privilege for me to be here this morning. As all of you know in this room, this school is unique. It's unique in this city, and it's unique in this country. Because of what it teaches, because of what it stands for, because of the history that it has. All of these things are just wonderful. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't realize that we're here. And so we're working on that because it's a treasure, this school is. The couple had never traveled more than 5 miles from their home. They lived in a modest, almost ramshackle place in the wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains. They farmed a small plot of ground that they had. They canned much of what they harvested, raised a few chickens, bought a cow from time to time from a close neighbor, and taught their young son from the Bible and other tattered books they had on the kitchen shelf. The man was the pastor of a small church of about 10 or 15 people that was within walking distance of their home. They had never traveled, as I said, more than 5 miles from their home, but they had a very, very happy life. When their son reached his 16th birthday, they decided that they should take him to the big city for him to explore what it might be like so he wouldn't be as backward as they were. They loaded up the farm truck and headed to the big city to stay in a hotel that one of their relatives had reserved for them. When they got to the city, they were overwhelmed at what they saw. Upon arriving at the hotel, it was nothing like they'd ever seen. 20 stories tall, made of mirrored glass, manicured grounds with no weeds, and a man in a uniform that came out and opened the truck door. The man told his wife to stay in the car while he and his son went in to register. A strange glass door opened automatically when they approached it. The floors were made of shiny marble. Polished brass hardware was everywhere, and the entire lobby shone from the light of a 3-story crystal chandelier. While standing in the lobby in utter amazement, they heard over in the corner a light ding sound. Looking across the lobby, they saw a very elderly lady enter into 2 shiny metal doors that immediately closed. A short time later, they heard another ding, and when the 2 small doors opened, a young, beautiful woman emerged. The man said to his son, "Go get Mama." Go get Mama. So, with that story in mind, I'd like for us to consider the topic this morning about which each of us in this room are keenly aware. We can't get away from it because we struggle with it from the womb. We are confronted by it from then on varying degrees until we finish our life here on earth. The challenge is unending and continuous, but there is a path of rescue, a path of relief from the onslaught. Success can be achieved. The topic of which I am speaking this morning is Christian contentment. The man in our story was completely content, and then he experienced a ding moment that changed his desire and his wants, and that can happen to us as well when we experience our own dings in life. Many people experienced dings last Friday, Black Friday, when most, if not all, of the major retailers offered deals that were hard to pass up, even if you didn't need what was offered. There's the encounter that we all have with the ubiquitous billboards along the highways and roads that we travel regularly. The mail regularly brings into our homes ding opportunities that include a multitude of catalogs, sales sheets, money back offers that may or may not contain a new ding for us. Challenges to be dinged abound. But what exactly is this thing called Christian contentment? One commentator wrote this describing Christian contentment, quote, "Contentment is an inner sense of peace or rest that comes from being right with God and knowing that He is in control of all that happens to us. It means having our focus on the kingdom of God and serving Him, not on the love of money and things. Continuing. Only genuine believers can fully and truly have contentment. For in the final analysis, contentment is not a natural attainment, but a supernatural gift from our Heavenly Father to His children. To say it another way, a believer's degree of contentment in this world is a reflection of their degree of contentment with the world to come. The more the invisible, eternal realities grip our heart, the less the visible, temporal things of this world will have power over us to cause us discontentment. If we give serious thought to this writer's definition, we can quickly understand that there is absolutely no help, no merit, no success in striving to achieve true Christian contentment in our own strength. The problem for us is we all struggle with this to one degree or another from time to time. Many have tried and many have ultimately failed. In 1 Kings 3, and you don't need to follow through with this if you don't want to, but I'll just, because I have a lot of verses to read for you. But in 1 Kings 3, Solomon had recently been made king and started his reign as his father, following his father David. And we are told that he mostly walked in his father's footsteps, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. In verse 9 of that same chapter, he says this to God. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. This is an excellent request by Solomon, and as we would expect, God has an answer and a plan. In the vision, he says to Solomon in verse 11, starting in verse 11, because you have asked this thing, and have not asked for yourself long life, or have asked riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall anyone like you arise after you. I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you in all your days. Solomon instantly became the wisest person that had ever lived, as well as one of, if not the richest man that ever lived. The only problem for Solomon were the conditions that followed God's blessing of wisdom. Because in verse 14, God says this, if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments, as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. He followed in his father's footsteps, so to speak, for a time, by keeping God's statutes and his commandments, except for a few seemingly minor missteps, like continuing to offer sacrifices at the high places and marrying a daughter of Pharaoh. But he also built the temple according to God's plan with a few Solomon choices. Built he and his Egyptian wife each a home, which is difficult to describe because of how opulent they were. He built lavish resorts, a zoo, riding stables, consulted with kings and queens, especially the Queen of Sheba, and he built a strong, self-sustaining government. His base annual income from gold alone in today's dollars was $44 million. Solomon was a rich, ambitious, wise, good-looking, energetic, prideful, and lustful king. And eventually all of that caught up with him. In Ecclesiastes 1:17, and remembering what Solomon had asked God for in his prayer, which was, give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil, verse 17 says this in Ecclesiastes 1. And I, set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realize that this also is striving after wind. Because in much wisdom there's much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. Then in chapter 2, verse 1, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure, so enjoy yourself. And behold, it too was futility. I said of laughter, it is madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine, while my mind was guiding me wisely in how to take hold of folly, until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives. I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself. I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had home-born slaves. I also possessed flocks and herds larger than all of those that preceded me in Jerusalem. Also, I collected for myself silver and gold, and the treasure of kings and provinces I provided for myself, male and female singers and pleasures of men, many concubines. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. Verse 10 says, all that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. Did you catch a trend here in Solomon's thoughts? Over 20 times we read the word I. At least 7 times we read of things he did for myself. In verse 9, he pronounced that he had become great, and that his heart was pleased because of all he had accomplished because of my labor. Solomon had gotten to a place in his life where he was the star. He was the one responsible for all he possessed. He did it all because he was so smart, because he was so rich, and because he was so virile. God was gone from his thinking, and after reflecting upon everything he said, he ended up in despair. Verse 11 again. Thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was vanity and striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. But we're not finished. There's more Solomon choices to consider. 1 Kings 11, Solomon loved many foreign or strange women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon held fast to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. Now, folks, I have to stop here for a second. We read earlier, and I don't doubt it at all, that Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived, and so as a result, I don't doubt that principle at all. However, 700 wives, 300 concubines. No wonder Scripture says in another place that he was about 60 when he died. As an old man, I'm surprised he lasted that long. 300 concubines and 700 wives. Scripture continues. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not follow the Lord fully, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Shemash, the detestable idol of Moab on the mountain which is east in Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable god of the sons of Ammon. Thus also he did for all his foreign wives, burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Verse 9 says, now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. Solomon's wives had turned his heart away from the one true God, the God of his father, to multiple other gods whose worship included, worship in quotation marks, included lewd sexual practices and child sacrifice. So, the question maybe in your mind, and rightfully so, is why is this guy talking about Solomon for so long? After all, we are in the 20th century. None of us are as smart or as rich as he was, and we probably have this contentment thing down fairly well. I spent some time to illustrate that Solomon was an over-the-top example of failure to become content using his own strength. And he was the wisest and smartest man perhaps have ever lived. None of us in this room even come close to his wisdom or intelligence. So, I think we have discovered so far that we cannot achieve Christian contentment in our own strength, as Solomon so glaringly proved. I, perhaps like you, have tried to find contentment in my own strength, using my own vast wisdom and superior intelligence, and have failed just like Solomon, although on a much less grand scale. All of Solomon's contentment challenges had to do with his heart condition, that innermost seat of our affection and purpose. So, contentment cannot be obtained without the right heart attitude. Philippians 4, Paul speaking, we read this in verse 10. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lack opportunity. Now in verse 11 he says, not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. The context of this passage is that Paul is lovingly writing to the Philippian believers with a thankful heart for their wonderful, gracious, and sacrificial gift to him, delivered by Epaphroditus. Perhaps it could be money, maybe food, or perhaps some clothing. We simply don't know. What we do know, though, is that the apostle was overwhelmingly grateful. Paul was in prison, chained to a Roman guard, probably in a small Roman apartment, but for sure in isolation. Not a pleasant place to be for someone like Paul. Below the surface of circumstance, however, we see a picture of a greatly contented man. The first principle we can get from his current condition is that he was completely and confidently convinced that he served a sovereign God. He knew, yes, he had learned, that all circumstances in this life were in God's most capable hands. And if God gave a proper season, a proper time, and a proper opportunity, that God would order the circumstances so his needs would be met. How did Paul learn this valuable lesson? By experiencing God at work in his life, just like you and I, if you've been a Christian for any length of time, can attest to. Paul says this, not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstance I am. Again, knowing how to get along with humble means, I also know how to live in prosperity in any and every circumstance. I have learned this secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The secret Paul mentions here in verse 12 is described in verse 13. I can do all things all things through him who strengthens me. Now, what is exclusive of all things? Nothing. All things. We who have challenges of life, those things that come our way, that if we have learned the correct heart attitude, can be used by God to enable us to learn contentment. And Paul had many challenges of life that helped him learn contentment, didn't he? 2 Corinthians 11 tells us many, none of which we have suffered, by the way. Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. I more so, in far more labors, in far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have spent in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, in dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers in the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship, through many sleepless nights in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And then he ends up all of this stuff. Here's what he says. Apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. Through all of this and more, Paul learned contentment. But if we, like Paul, really believe that God is sovereign, and he is, and if we believe that God orders all circumstances to accomplish his own holy purposes for our ultimate good, and he does, then we can be confident in anything, because everything is under his control. Discontentment comes to me and to you when we try to control things, when we try to achieve contentment in our own strength, wisdom, and resources. And if we're honest with ourselves, we all have to admit that at one time, a few times, or maybe several times, we have thought and acted like we knew better than God about some situation in our life. That's just the way it is, because of who we are. The second principle is that in retrospect, we can see that even the events we choose, God uses providentially in working to obtain his purposes. What Paul's life, as well as any believer's life today, demonstrates is that God's providence is always at work in the lives of his people. Listen to this very well-known verse, Romans 8:28, and we know that God causes all things, that's his providence, to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. That's sovereignty. Providence and sovereignty in this one verse. With the realization that God is sovereign, that God uses his providential working in the lives of his people for their good and his glory, we now have to further consider how we, living today, can become contented. Part of the answer is from 1 Timothy 6. Paul here was warning Timothy concerning